Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we connect academic insights and practical marketing. Each week, we go deep behind some of the country's best brands to reveal the behavioral science that powers them. I'm Michael Aaron Slicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today, we're uncovering the behavioral science that powers Kraft Foods, the brand that started with very humble beginnings in 1903 that has grown to one of the largest food companies in the world. Let's get into it. So, Richard, Kraft macaroni and cheese is a staple of my American upbringing. I'm not sure about all Americans' upbringings, certainly my American upbringing. Was it something that you knew about growing up in the United Kingdom?
I knew about macaroni and cheese,
Yes.
but didn't know about Kraft. So wasn't Kraft Mac and Cheese wasn't a big
Was
brand
not a
here.
big
No.
was not a big
No.
brand here in the UK. So for all of our listeners, let me give everybody a little bit of a zoom out on Kraft as a business and some interesting history on macaroni and cheese in general, because it has fascinating roots to both world wars. And then we'll get into some of the keys of how Kraft has used behavioral science insights to power a lot of their success. So Heinz Kraft is now one company, the fifth largest food and beverage company in the world, and they have amazing brands: Philadelphia cream cheese, Oscar Mayer, Kraft, and Capri Sun. In 2023 to 2024 fiscal years, they reported $26.5 billion of sales. So this is big business. And they have what they call their 8 cornerstone brands, 8 brands that do $1 billion a year or more. Kraft macaroni and cheese is one of their cornerstone brands. So we're talking about a lot of macaroni and cheese. In fact, 1 million boxes of macaroni and cheese are sold each day across the world. It's a lot of macaroni and cheese. But the history of how Kraft Mac and Cheese came to be is really quite interesting. So Kraft, as the original food company, is founded in 1903 by James Kraft, who purchased cheese in Chicago's Water Street wholesale market and then would cut it up and sell it to local retailers. And he secures a patent in 1916 for a way to sterilize cheese and keep it fresh for longer. So this is critical because as the U.S. goes into World War I, having a way to keep cheese fresh longer means we can have cheese on the front lines in World War I. Then during the Great Depression, there's another leader, a St. Louis salesman, Grant Leslie, who has the idea, what if we take macaroni and we combine it with cheese? And so he starts with Kraft in 1937 by taking boxes of macaroni and putting cheese with a rubber band on the outside.
Yeah.
And you would literally make the macaroni, boil it, and then put the cheese in. This is critical during the Great Depression and then going into World War II, because a box of that would serve 4 servings of macaroni and cheese was 19 cents or 1 food ration. So, I mean, it was really an economical way to feed a family, and it was delicious. And for a lot of those that were involved in the war effort, it was 9 minutes to make a meal. So it was fast, it was tasty, and it was very inexpensive. So what started as a story of how we can use preservatives and how we can create a low cost meal obviously changes over time to the 2000s, 2010s, and up to today, where people don't want preservatives in their food. And Kraft needs to make a decision. And in 2016, they decide to remove yellow dye number 5 and other preservatives in the food. So what started as the reason they became so successful eventually is becoming a detriment, and they know they need to change it. What they do to change it is going to be part of our episode today, and how they made it such a success when they changed the formulation and the taste profile of mac and cheese as they did it. So that's one thing that we'll talk about, how they swapped out yellow 5 and yellow 6 and replaced them with paprika, turmeric, and other natural flavors. So that'll be super interesting. And then the other thing that we'll dive into today is the way that Kraft has designed their packaging to really endear themselves and get noticed on the shelf. We're going to talk about something called the pareidolia effect.
Yes, pareidolia. This idea that people tend to see patterns where none exist. And pareidolia is a particular example of that, is where we see visual patterns.
Got it.
So a plug socket might look like a face to us.
Two little eyes in it.
Yeah, we often perceive faces or face-like images when they're not actually there to all intents and purposes. And that is something that Kraft Mac and Cheese use really cleverly on their packaging to grab people's attention in the retail environment.
Perfect. So we'll talk about how they made a massive change to their formulation and made it a success, and then we'll talk about this use of the pareidolia effect in their packaging. So let's get started. So starting on the story of how they changed their ingredients and changed the formulation. Can you talk a little bit about this case study?
It's a brilliant example, I think, of applying behavioural science in action. They had a dilemma that there was increasing interest in health in America. So when they launched in 1903, processed was a fantastic word.
It science of the future.
Yeah, it meant safety. Cheese could kill you. You could catch diseases from gone off cheese. So back in that era, process was an unalloyed benefit. Now they're in a situation 5 or 10 years ago where people see preservatives as unnatural, unhealthy, and stuff that shouldn't be in your body. The problem, though, is what Kraft also very sensibly realised is there is a tussle in people's minds. So they know they rationally shouldn't have this type of chemical in their body. But also people, especially in America, we'll come to maybe the cultural differences, there is this blending between tasty and unhealthy. Now, that's not speculation. There's a wonderful study by Raghunathan where this psychologist, I think it's the McCombs Business School associated with the University of Texas, he serves people a Indian buffet and he gets their ratings of all the different foods.
Mm-hmm.
He's only interested in their scores for the yogurt drink, the mango lassi. And some of the participants, he says the mango lassi is a health drink, some it's an unhealthy drink.
Okay.
And even though the participants are all given exactly the same yogurt drink, those that are told it's unhealthy rate it as 55% tastier than those that are told it's healthy. People have a preconception, in America especially, and I think Britain too, that health food is going to be poor tasting. And unfortunately, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think something's going to be bad tasting, we look for evidence to confirm that. If we think it's going to be unhealthy, if we think it's healthy, we assume it will be bad tasting, and that often becomes true.
I mean, that's what the Raghunathan study is showing.
Yes, exactly. The point I keep on mentioning, I think Britain and America are interchangeable here, but it's not true in every culture. There is some evidence, it's only a one-off study, but in France, you don't find this effect. People don't assume health food is going to be untasty. But certainly I think in the Anglo-Saxon world, Anglo-centric world, there is this problem. So what Kraft realised is if they go out and tell people we've got rid of all the nasty artificial colourings and preservatives, people will probably say, yay, that's a good thing. But when they taste it,
they've already set their mind.
Exactly. Even if the product doesn't actually taste any different, they will assume it does, and they will create in their own mind a problem.
So they go about to solve this by not telling people they made the change.
Exactly.
Or not telling them publicly. So what was the campaign that they ran?
Yeah. So they change the formulation. They remove the nasty chemicals and put in natural alternatives. Obviously, legally on the ingredients,
it's on the box the way it is.
They have to say, but not many people look at that in detail. But they make no public announcement. They don't put a starburst on the front of the pack saying artificials removed. They don't have any TV ads.
Right.
And then for a considerable period, let's say 3 months or 6 months, they maintain silence. And then they reveal what they've done. They say they've created the world's largest blind taste test. You've all been eating mac and cheese. As you say, they're selling 1 million boxes a day. You've all been eating this. We've sold 50 million boxes and no one could taste the difference. And that is a very effective way of avoiding this belief that healthy food is going to taste bad. So there is a lovely study that Shane Frederick and Dan Ariely were involved in, which shows if you have to tell people a bit of what might be perceived as bad news, make sure they've tried the food first. So for their study, they do this in pubs in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 388 pub goers. They give them a taste test. Do you prefer Bud or MIT Brew? And some people, that's all they're told. They drink these 2 beers and 59% prefer MIT Brew. Now, that might not sound that strange, but MIT Brew was Budweiser plus a few drops of balsamic vinegar. So people actually prefer Bud with balsamic, at least in Cambridge, with a few bits of balsamic vinegar. Next group, same 2 beers, but they tell the people beforehand, Bud or MIT Brew, and we put balsamic vinegar in the MIT Brew. Now the proportion of people who prefer the MIT Brew drops to 30%.
Down.
Putting balsamic vinegar is not a great thing in a beer. People think it's going to taste awful, and they find evidence to confirm that. When they taste it, they're looking a little bit closer for an unpleasantness. Third group they test this with, so it's Bud versus MIT Brew again. People sample both beers, and then before they state their preference, so they've sampled the beers, before they're asked to state their preference, the researchers say, oh, by the way, MIT Brew has balsamic vinegar in. Now, if you give people the negative information after sampling, it doesn't have the same detrimental effect. It's not as strong a preference as completely blind. Rather than 59% preferring MIT Brew, it's now 52%. But that is a hell of a lot better
than 39%.
Exactly. So the point here would be, if you feel like you have to reveal a piece of negative news, and I'm using negative news about healthiness in a specific sense, but if you have to tell people, make sure they sample it first and then reveal the information. Obviously, the Kraft Mac and Cheese campaign is a very specific way of doing that, and it's on a grand scale. But you could think about this on a micro scale at your local Costco. If you're sampling a low-fat yogurt or a ice cream with added vitamins, get people to try it
before,
and then reveal the health benefit.
Yeah.
Really small change in ordering, but can have a significant effect.
Because what we're doing here is we're helping to highlight that their perception of what they think will be the case because of the fact is debunked when they taste it first. So what we're doing is we're helping drive a wedge between a preconceived notion and the actual experience of the taste that they have on its own.
Exactly. They are neutrally sampling the product. They then make a judgment about whether they like the product or not. And the negative information that comes later, because people have already formed their expectations, you negate the negative information to most of it. You don't completely remove the negativity, but you remove most of it.
So sometimes there's a change that needs to be made because your brand's doing it, but this can also be valuable if there's, let's say, a legislation change or a reporting requirement change, and you have to make a change to your product. For example, having to remove sugar from food or limit calories.
Yeah, so in Britain, there have been some quite stringent taxes on soft drinks that have high sugar levels. And a lot of manufacturers, both in soft drinks and beyond, have thought about reformulating their products. And in cereals, for example, where the legislation hasn't come in yet, but manufacturers are probably nervous about it, some manufacturers have emblazoned their packaging with 10% less sugar, and they have suffered in terms of sales. Others have very gradually removed sugar, 1% at a time in small increments so people don't notice. They've kept that silent, and they're the ones that have maintained their sales levels. So you can apply this, yes, in mac and cheese and the removal of artificial colorers, but there's lots of other applications in many different areas within food.
I love that because in the mac and cheese example, the case study really shows how you can use communication to help blunt the sales effects of having to make this change. What you just explained with the cereal manufacturers is you can make changes over a period of time incrementally that can have a similar effect. And of course, you then time your messaging, if at all, based on what's best for the brand. So,
Yeah.
two different ways to solve a challenge like this.
Absolutely.
So let's go to a commercial break. And when we come back, we'll get into the second behavioral science insight that Kraft has used brilliantly to help grow their sales.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Method One is a team of modern marketers that practices the art and science of behavior change to fuel growth for indulgence brands. We do this by building interconnected marketing ecosystems that place the human experience at the center of brand building strategies across owned, earned, and paid media. To learn how to leverage behavioral science in your marketing or advertising, visit us at www.methodone.com.
Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we connect academic insights and practical marketing to help you grow your brand or business. Today, we're going deep on Kraft Macaroni and Cheese. So, Richard, before the break, we were talking about how Kraft created this great campaign of the largest blind taste test in the world to announce that they had actually changed the formulation of Kraft Mac and Cheese before they made a big campaign out of it. They were removing unwanted ingredients like preservatives and in food dyes and replacing it with more natural ingredients. And now we want to change our attention and look at packaging, and specifically the way that Kraft uses the macaroni elbows, as we call them in America, to create more resonance as people are looking at the shelf. Can you describe this a little bit more?
One of the features of the packaging is a macaroni elbow is on the packaging, but it's upturned, and it bears resemblance to a smile. And that is a smart feature to have on packaging, because even very subtle patterns like that tap into a effect called pareidolia, which is a tendency to see visual patterns when none, or give meaning to visual patterns when none really exist. So one of the main versions of that is seeing faces and things. You look at a cloud, you see a person, a burnt bit of cheese on toast, you might see someone's face. And faces are remarkably important from a psychological point of view because they attract our attention. From an evolutionary perspective, you were much more likely to survive if you quickly identified a face, whether it was on a predator like a lion, a potential mate on a human. So we are hardwired to spot faces very quickly. And to the extent that even a random selection of items, that might have two dots and a line, we will interpret very quickly as a face. Now, that isn't just based on an evolutionary argument. There are some wonderful studies that have tested this in the world of advertising. So Guido is at the University of Salento in Italy, and he showed participants 36 pairs of ads. So one ad might, have a bland claim about Twix, eat a Twix, get some energy. The other ad would be eat a Twix, get some energy, and there would be 2 mugs of coffee with a banana below. So they were using a pareidolian image. It looked a little bit like a face. And Guido shows these pairs of images for a couple of seconds or less to the participants. And 80% of the time, the image that had the face-like pattern got more of the attention. Interestingly, when he cut the data, it was on the shortest exposures that effect was greatest. So when people just saw the ads for less than half a second, 92% of the time, more of their attention using eye tracking went to the pareidolia image rather than the non-pareidolia image. Guido's argument backs up this idea that our attention is drawn to faces or face-like images. And that's something that Kraft exploit. The little macaroni elbow on the packaging looks a little bit like a face, and in a crowded, busy environment like a store, that's enough to grab people's attention. And it's those small variations, that little bit more attention that's going to make it more likely that someone spots you on a busy shelf. And if they spot you, they're more likely to put you into the basket.
Yeah, and I think this really drives home the point that we have to be thinking about how we adjust all elements of our brand. And sometimes in our podcast, we're talking about big things that you would need to change, offers, pricing. This is something, while it's never a light matter to change your packaging, the way you display your pasta elbows, arguably there's lots of ways that are all equally about good. This gives you a bump up in immediately capturing people's attention that can really make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a danger of ignoring these small gains. We've just had the Olympics, and Britain have a good heritage in the last 20 years of being very successful at cycling. The most famous coach in the world of British cycling was Brailsford. And his whole theory was around marginal gains. It was the idea that lots of tiny incremental improvements in all sorts of areas added up to a massive advantage over the competition. So you might think, well, turning a pasta elbow from a sideways angle to an up angle that make it look like a face isn't going to change the business. But if you start doing enough of these psychological interventions across your packaging, your messaging, your in-store, then cumulatively they can have a great impact.
What comes to mind for me, Richard, is that it's not just that it looks like a face, but that it looks like a smile. And to me, if you think about other smiles, McDonald's with the smile, Amazon where they connect A to Z with what looks like a smile, using the pareidolia effect, but not just to get to recognition of a face. What comes to mind in America, there's a famous tutoring group called Kumon, and noticeably, there's no smile on that logo. It feels different. The emotional connection is different when you have a smile.
Yeah, and interestingly, if you look at a watch ad, so pretty much any fancy watch, Tag Heuer, Rolex, whatever it is, if you look at the actual watch itself, the time is always set to like 5 to 1. The hands for the hour and the minute are shaped to look like a smile. So that's something watch ads have been doing for 50 years. I hadn't thought about the fact that it was a smile. That's an interesting one. I've not seen any studies that prove the effectiveness, but it's a nice touch.
In the realm of trying to create an emotional feeling in people rather than just saying the emotion, at least my human experience, if somebody's smiling at you, it's hard to not smile back. If you're looking at an image that's smiling, it's hard to not see a little bit of levity or amicability in that smile looking at you.
Yeah, and there's certainly evidence that if it puts you in a good mood, and it might have been a fleeting one, but you just need that fleeting moment during the window of purchase. If you put someone in a good mood, they're more likely to notice ads, they're more likely to believe ads, they're more likely to like ads. So generating a small spark of positivity, that can be very powerful. Something worth testing.
Right. Something worth to consider, and then always something worth testing. Something Richard and I spend a lot of time talking about off camera and when we're doing work with clients is saying, why not test? What's the cost to give a test to see if it makes a difference in your business, see if it makes a difference on your brand? Now, changing packaging, taken very seriously before you make a change, but testing something in a digital ad, testing something on a small scale, a lot of opportunity to do that.
And we've been talking about crafts, so focused on packaging, but the Guido study was done with ads.
There you go.
And you mentioned online ads. That is an area where it's the most fleeting of attention. There's some lovely work by a research company called Lumen to show that most ads are seen for fractions of a second. So it's perhaps in that environment of online banner advertising where trying to introduce a face might not fit with your creative style, but a face-like object that's much more flexible. And it's a small thing you can do to grab attention. And frankly, if you don't get someone's attention, everything else is
Doesn't
academic.
matter. Yeah.
You have the best message in the world. If someone doesn't see it and read it, well, what have you achieved?
Understood. As we come to a close, let's, like we like to do, recap some of the big things that we talked about in today's episode.
So we started by talking about, in America and Britain, there is an association with healthiness and poor taste. And unfortunately, the Raghunathan study shows that that belief becomes self-fulfilling. If you tell someone your product's really healthy, they're going to assume it tastes worse, and the actual taste that they experience will become worse. So if you are a product that is removing sugars, removing fats, removing salt, the first question you have to ask yourself is, do I have to tell people? Maybe the best thing to do is to be silent about it so you don't have that negative effect on your taste. The second experiment we talked about was the beer test between Bud and MIT Brew. And the learning from that is, if you're going to tell people that you've become healthier, make sure you get them to try the product first, because those negative expectations won't have the damaging effect on your product if people have already experienced it. So if you're doing sampling of a healthy product, get people to try it and then mention the health message. You'll get the best of both worlds. And then the third and final part we talked about was the power in advertising of using a human face or images that look a little bit like a human face. This is the idea of pareidolia. We are hardwired to direct our attention to faces because this was either, for most of our evolutionary history, a threat or an opportunity. So think about, in your creative, can you introduce one of these pareidolian images, especially if you're in low attention environments like online or like in store, because it's a great proven way of increasing the probability that people direct their attention towards you.
Perfect. As we like to do, we like to wrap up learning a little bit more about our hosts. For me, a favorite childhood meal would have been like a hot dog and macaroni and cheese on the side. That would be a very comforting home cooked meal of my childhood. What from your side, knowing that macaroni and cheese was not a home cooked thing?
So corned beef hash.
Okay.
Now, is that a familiar dish?
No.
Okay. So it's corned beef out of a tin, fried up with onion and normally potatoes.
Yes.
But it was my dad's kind of dish that he would do once a month. And he always used rice. So corned beef hash, corned beef, onions,
And
rice, and quite a big dollop of tomato ketchup. That would bring back childhood memories, especially of my father, who had limited culinary abilities, but that was his one signature dish.
It would look, all people would make Kraft macaroni and cheese, but it would be one that even those of us with the least amount of culinary ability would look to make.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, that wraps up today's episode. If you found what we had to say today interesting, we'd love to ask you to leave us a review and follow us on YouTube. By following us on YouTube, it helps us reach more people just like you that will find our content interesting. Also, for more in-depth information on today's episode, including a full transcript, the live video that we are on camera with, and all the show notes, visit theconsumerbehaviorlab.com. And finally, to stay up to date with what we're doing beyond our podcast, follow us on LinkedIn, the Consumer Behavior Lab on LinkedIn. Make a connection with us there. Until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Thanks for joining us. Can't wait for you to hear next week's episode.